One more.
I know you're an Aldous Huxley fan, so I thought I'd ask you this question. After reading his book, Doors of Perception, in which he gives an account of his experience taking the psychedelic drug mescaline, he stated that in the final stages of egolessness, there is an obscene knowledge that all isn't all, that all is actually each. He then went on to say that this is as near, I take it, as a finite mind can ever get to perceiving everything that is happening in the universe. I was wondering if maybe you could explain what that means, because I've been trying to understand it for a month.
There was a neuroscientist a while back, whose name I don't remember, who had a stroke. And she, being a neuroscientist, was analyzing the neurological consequences of the stroke as it occurred. If I remember correctly, the stroke either temporarily or more permanently took out the function of large portions of her left hemisphere. And she had exactly that experience. It was an experience of ego dissolution, something like that. The felt sense of identity shifting from that sort of narrow boundary, maybe that you would define by the boundary of your physical being, into something that was much broader and much. It gets hard to describe this without, degenerating into hippie poetry from 1967 very, very rapidly. But it's something like a sense of the underlying unity of consciousness. That might be one way of thinking about it. We don't know much about consciousness. In fact, I don't think we know anything about consciousness. And obviously, consciousness is something that we all share, but it's also something that we seem to also experience individually. But maybe our individual consciousnesses are something like the manifestations of something that's a more unified consciousness underneath. I mean, that's hardly an original idea. But it does seem to be the case that under some circumstances, there are neurological transformations that make that link more apparent, assuming that the link exists. Now, you could say, well, no, they're just producing a delusion. But the funny thing about, delusions is that you got to think, well, how do you know something's a delusion? And the answer to that has to be something like, well, hardly anyone else thinks it. That would be criteria number one. But criteria number two would be, if you act on the delusion, does your ship sink? Because if your ship sinks, then it was a delusion. It's something like that. But if you act on your delusion and things get better, well, then maybe it wasn't a delusion. And there's no evidence from the psilocybin studies that have been conducted at Johns Hopkins that there was detrimental effects for the participants. And the participants certainly don't think that the effects were detrimental. So, and I've been hesitant to talk about any of this for obvious reasons. I'll tell you something really funny. I think it's funny anyways. I had Timothy Leary's old job at Harvard. So, and so Leary's a good object lesson in being very careful about this sort of thing, because it isn't obvious that his net effect was good. And I say that with some caution, because Leary was a very smart person and he was very creative. But he got tangled up in that hallucinogenic madhouse, that characterized the period from 1965 to about 1970. And it didn't seem to me that was altogether a good thing. The thing is, we have these chemicals now in our culture, and people are experimenting with them like mad. And making them illegal doesn't seem to be working, in large part because I think there were 7 to 20 known psychoactive substances that were illegal in the year 2000. There's something like 400 now, because labs all over the world keep tweaking the molecules, right? Because molecule A is illegal, so chemists just shift it a little bit. Then they have a new hallucinogen, and which might be fine and might not be, because now and then you can produce a chemical that's unbelievably dangerous. Fentanyl, sort of like that. There was a drug a while back that I can't remember the name. It was an acronym. It was a fun drug. If you took it once, it gave you permanent, irreversible, total Parkinson's disease. So people would take it, and they were frozen, and that was it. So MPTP, I think it was called. So because it destroyed the same area of the brain that the that Parkinson's destroys, except it did it right away. So, designer drugs, right? A little caution is in order. How we might approach the issue of hallucinogen use in a mature manner, well, that's a topic for an entirely other discussion. I'm not even necessarily sure that it can be approached that way, although I would say, at minimum, determining what it is that you're up to if you're going to experiment would be a good thing. Like, what is it exactly that you're serving? They're not party drugs. They're not for fun, right? Whatever they are, that's not what they're for. And so maybe they could be used by people who are carefully orienting themselves towards the good, although I wouldn't say that that should be read as a recommendation.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right. We'll see you next week. Thank you.